Hello, my name is Russ Crabtree. I'm the president of Holy Cow Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to iSight. A number of regional associations, middle judicatories for some, have made the decision to seek a purpose to be transformational in their work. What do I mean by that? Well, first it means that they've adopted a vision of actually creating healthy, vital congregations. That's number one. But secondly, it means that they have realigned their resources, staff, finances, and organizational structure to actually accomplish that purpose. The third thing they've done is create an organizational culture that actually begins to reward behavior that is consistent with achieving that vision. The fourth piece is that they have developed a system of organizational intelligence which informs their decision-making processes as they seek to create those healthy, vital congregations. Now, I've come to believe that that fourth item of organizational intelligence is absolutely critical to the entire endeavor. In fact, I think it's very difficult to achieve any kind of transformational goal without rethinking how we develop organizational intelligence to inform our decision-making processes and our allocation of resources. Now, in this presentation, we're going to be looking at 4 sources of organizational intelligence and how that information can feed into a number of key functions for a regional association. Now, in reality, there are a lot more than 4. We're just going to pick 4 of them to try and illustrate how those pieces of information can make such a difference in the work that you do. I hope this is helpful to you. If we look at the roles in a typical regional association, there's generally a person in an executive role or the role of bishop or conference minister. You have staff members, and of course the larger the regional association, the more staff you have. You have individuals serving as volunteers, providing a variety of services, and then you have committees or task forces. They generally, in a transformational regional association, are focused primarily upon churches. By that we mean clergy, people in lay leadership positions, and the congregation as a whole. Now, that entire effort is informed by a data set, an information set that generally includes these things. First, there are some facts, generally what I call count data. What is the worship attendance? What is the membership? What are the financial revenue and expenditure data? Some observations that are made by persons that are in these roles as they interact with congregations. Some generalizations that they may make. For example, they look at a church's size and they conclude that is, for example, a program church, and then they generalize what they know about program churches to a particular congregation of that size. And then there, of course, are stories that are about a regional association, about a particular congregation or its leadership, generally that we hear second or third hand. It is that information set that generally is informing folks who need to make these important decisions about how to serve churches. Now, there are a number of key functions that regional association leaders play relative to congregations. These are a few of them. First, what I call pastoral oversight, visiting the church on some kind of regular basis, whether that's done by a bishop or a conference minister or by a committee on ministry, for example, that visits the church on some periodic basis. Then there are those complaints that are called into people in leadership coming from the congregation. Those are all issues of pastoral oversight. Then there's succession management, what most people would call transition ministry, helping churches that are going through a succession process find a person that's a good fit for that particular congregation, where it is now and where it wants to go, managing transition. That is, what are the issues that need to be addressed to establish a good platform for that new person to start from, and then startup. How do we start that next person on a positive trajectory? And then there's congregational development. How do we help a congregation plan for its future, and how do we track a congregation to see how it's actually doing relative to its plan? There's resourcing that needs to be provided. That can be in the form of training, that can be in the form of financial grants, but then there's also the boundary question. When are we putting resources into a church, for example, that are not likely to have a positive outcome for the church? And then finally, there's professional development. How do we work with our clergy base in terms of coaching them, and how do we help manage risks related to those clergy and their well-being? Now, typically, each one of these functions is fed an information set consisting of what we talked about in the previous slide: facts, observations, generalizations, and stories. And often those are streams of information that are to some extent independent of one another, because you can have different individuals, volunteers, or groups performing these different functions relative to congregations. So because you have different people, they may have the same facts, but they have different observations. They may have different content conceptually from which they generalize, and they're hearing different stories. So you often have different data streams feeding these different functions within a regional association as they're seeking to create those healthy, vital congregations. And while they're not totally independent of one another, there is some shared knowledge. I try and indicate that with this kind of cloud of information that's held coming from these different streams of experience that people are having with a congregation. Unfortunately, that often leads to a considerable amount of confusion, because even when we talk to the leaders in a particular congregation, our research shows us that they often are not clear as a group about where the congregation is. So that makes it even more difficult when you take it to the level of a regional association, as they seek to provide the kinds of services to congregations that will help them be healthy and vital. And that confusion negatively impacts the ability of leaders to make significant achievements. And that pretty consistently undermines the regional association morale. So how can we do things differently? Well, the vision here is to provide a body of information called OI, Organizational Intelligence. We abbreviate it OI. And that this body of information can inform all of these functions. So in a sense, everybody is operating from the same page in terms of where a particular congregation is, where it wants to go, what it needs, etc. Now, what I want to do is just talk about 4 pieces of organizational intelligence. You know, typically, at least in denominational churches, we have information related to worship attendance, membership, finances, maybe Christian education. We have 4 pieces of information on a congregation. Well, what about information from a congregation that's what I call witness data, where we learn from listening to the members? And we're just going to be looking at 4 critical aspects of a congregation, 4 pieces of organizational intelligence. There's a lot more that can be looked at, but we're going to look at 4. And the first is the position, the starting point. Where is a congregation now? Often we have congregations that develop great vision statements for where they want to go, but if they don't have clarity about where they are now, well, as somebody said, if you know where you want to go but don't know where you are now, that is the operational definition of being lost. So the first thing we look at is, where is a congregation now? We look at that in terms of energy and satisfaction. And we have churches with lower energy, you know, down at the bottom, higher energy up at the top, low satisfaction to the left, and high satisfaction to the right. And this gives us 4 quadrants that give us a pretty good idea of where a congregation is a starting point. High energy, high satisfaction, we call that transformational. Low energy, high satisfaction, we call that static. It's like a car you really love that's out of gas. On the lower left-hand quadrant, low energy, low satisfaction, we call that the recovery quadrant. And then the upper left-hand quadrant, high energy, low satisfaction, we call that the chaos quadrant. Then we ask people, where do you want to go in the future? Where do you want additional energy invested? And you can see that in this particular congregation, they want to reach new people. They want to grow. The third priority relates to relationship. This is a comparison with other churches. This is an unusually high priority for this church, meaningful relationships. And then we see a couple of priorities relating to the process by which members are called and equipped for ministry and then supported when they're in ministry. So we have a particular set of priorities where people want to go that relate to growth, relationships, and developing the process by which leaders are called, developed, and supported. Then we look at organizational culture. Now, there are lots of ways of looking at culture. Here we look at flexibility. So we have churches that are more settled, that like to find a familiar way of doing things and stick with it at the bottom. We have more adaptable churches at the top. We have theologically more progressive churches to the left and more conservative churches to the right. And that gives us, again, 4 quadrants that tell us a lot about the organizational intelligence of a particular church. And each quadrant has its strengths, and each quadrant has its shadow side. We call this upper right-hand quadrant adaptable conservative performance. Most of your megachurches are up here. Lower right-hand quadrant we call hearth and home, conservative settled. Lower left, progressive settled, we call the paraclete quadrant. And then the upper left-hand quadrant, adaptable progressive, we call the magi quadrant. This tells us a tremendous amount about a particular congregation and the way it functions as an organizational culture. And finally, we have the last piece of organizational intelligence, which tells us what is the level of urgency of the issues that the church is dealing with internally. Anything over 50, the church is in crisis. Anything up from 35 to 50 are important issues that really need to be discussed soon. Anything from 20 to 35 are things of significance that require conversation. You stop dropping down below 20, you get into the noise level of the instrument. But this tells us what are the issues that need to be addressed in the congregation and how urgent are they. One of the things that we notice here, there are a number of issues related to the clergy person. So we have 4 critical pieces of information on this particular church and on any church that is a part of the organizational intelligence set that the regional association is dealing with. The position or starting point, where the church would like to go, what is the organizational culture that it's got to work through, and how urgent are the issues that are present internally in the church. So now we want to just take a look at some of these functions and how organizational intelligence impacts them directly. So let's take the first, which is that pastoral oversight. So let's say that you are a bishop, for example, and you are making the rounds in terms of visiting churches on some kind of regular basis. And you can pull this information up, and I have it here on a cell phone screen because that's the way we're designing this organizational intelligence. You can pull it up, look at it on the screen. You see this particular church is in the chaos quadrant. So this church needs leadership to help it negotiate and come into alignment. So part of what you might need to address or want to address in a sermon or in teaching is how do you help a church kind of come to a common set of purposes? Or in your preaching and teaching, you might want to talk about strategies for the church's future, where it wants to go in terms of how do you grow a church, how do you form relationships, how do you develop leadership. People would have an open ear to that kind of message that might be brought. You look at this particular church and you can see it's clearly on the more progressive side. So if you're doing preaching or teaching in this church, you're going to want to realize that that congregation that you're working with is theologically more progressive and frame your message in a way that they can connect to. And you can see that there are a number of issues in this church that are of significant urgency that you might want to address as well. Notice particularly how many of these have to do with the clergy. This is what we call a clergy-centric or focused congregation. So if we look at this pastoral oversight function, you might want to teach in your preaching and teaching, recognize you've got a progressive audience, address growth strategies, how to develop relationships in the congregation, or to develop leadership. You may want to have some directed conversation around their priorities, use some appreciative inquiry to see how they have been able to make progress in areas related to the goals. And you might want to use the information to deal with complaints. So, for example, in this particular church, the most urgent need had to do with clergy developing a pastoral care plan. So if somebody calls you up and says, and this actually happened, I was in the hospital and I didn't get a call. And in one case, a bishop had this data, and the bishop said, no one from the church came to see you. Oh, no, people from the church came to see me, was the response, but the pastor didn't come to see me. At which point the bishop had an opportunity to talk about the pastoral ministry of the congregation, not just the clergy person. And in a clergy-focused congregation, they tend to focus more on those actions of the pastor rather than the ministry of the congregation. So let's go back and look at succession management. How does this data set affect the way we think about, well, who would be a good fit for this congregation? Let's go back to the data set. We're going to go through this again. So here we see that this is a church that's in the chaos quadrant. So that tells us, number one, we need a leader here who can help negotiate differences between people who are excited about ministries but are not working very well together to get alignment. So some negotiating skills will be important for this person. We need a person who can help the church think about growth and the kinds of changes that will be required to do that, but also someone who can work either directly or through a staff to create a more meaningful set of relationships among the members, and that can invest a significant amount of time and skill in developing that leadership pool. This church is going to need a pastor that is able to appreciate and relate to a much more progressive theological perspective, but also who is able to initiate and deal with change. This is a congregation that's used to change and appreciates variety, and this is going to require a pastor who is comfortable in a role of being a primary focus of the congregation, is able to kind of use that position to advance the ministry of the church. So this is a place for a pastor who's comfortable being kind of on stage in the center, but it also needs to be a pastor who has good boundaries, has a well-bounded ego. So you put all of that together, and you get some criteria for what would be a good fit. Someone resonant with a particular theology and adaptable culture, critical abilities of growing a church, building relationships, leadership support, and negotiating to alignment. A leadership style that's comfortable center stage, but with a bounded ego. Now, I find this is a much better way to get clarity about what would be a good fit for a congregation than just asking congregational members to tell you what we want in our next pastor. Now let's look at congregational development and tracking. And I'm not going to go through all of these again, but we could. Let's just move straight to the congregational development page and remembering the data that we've looked at, those 4 pieces of organizational intelligence. What do we need to look at? Well, strategic tasks would include overcoming diffusion, which is what tends to happen in those alignment and those magi churches. Actually, let me go back and take a look at that, because this can be helpful. Not this one, but this one. This church is up in this what we call magi quadrant. One of the strengths of this quadrant, folks up here tend to be well-educated. They tend to be inclusive. They tend to be articulate, advocates. A lot of wonderful strengths of the magi quadrant, but everyone has a shadow side. Every quadrant has a shadow side. And the shadow side of this quadrant is they tend to be so open that it's difficult for them to coalesce around a particular identity and vision. So often they'll go years and years and years without getting clarity about that. So what's really needed in congregational development is overcome that diffusion, develop alignment to a particular direction, equip people for conflict resolution, and clarify that clergy role. Do we want to continue to be this clergy-focused congregation where how people think about the entire church is all through the filter of a clergy person? We want to track energy and satisfaction over time, and we want to celebrate progress going northeast. What do we mean by that? Well, when we look at this, this map, we always want to move congregations northeast toward this high energy, high satisfaction. So what kind of actions can we take to do that? Because now we have a way of measuring it to see if they're actually making progress. And we want to monitor slippage toward the recovery quadrant. We want to run this instrument every couple of years, and we want to find out, are we moving to the northeast, or are we continuing to slip down into this quadrant? Because if we're slipping, it means we're probably not adopting the right strategies. Then we want to look at resourcing. As we look at this particular congregation, there are a number of training possibilities. How we develop interpersonal relationships could involve small group ministries. These are things related to their goals. How to become a more missional church in terms of reaching the community, training people on resolving conflict. How do we develop that and that leadership support, and how do we develop the ministry of the people? When we talk about boundaries, I would say the potential return on financial investment in this congregation is relatively low at this point. We would need to make some changes for it to be a place where financial investment would have a higher probability of actually paying off and bearing fruit for the kingdom. And then finally, professional development, coaching and mentoring. Again, we look at this particular chart, and assuming that this pastor is in place, what kind of professional development would be helpful in this particular church? Well, helping the pastor develop systems of pastoral care. That was the most urgent critical success factor, you remember. Working with the organizational structure and developing it to flatten it out, connecting people to its leadership in a little bit different way. And then there's a clergy profile that's provided in organizational intelligence. That's not a part of these 4 pieces we look at. It goes back confidentially to the clergy person and looks at worship and preaching. It looks at pastoral care, and it looks at leadership. And that gives you a really good opportunity to do some professional development around where the church is going, but also around the strengths and potential work areas of that particular clergy person. The risk areas in a clergy-focused congregation, which this is, are either burnout or flame out. They either get burned out, worn out, or they end up exhibiting behaviors that are difficult or inappropriate. And real risks for a church in this particular position of calling a narcissistic personality. So there's some real opportunities here as we look at this church's profile to develop that professional leadership, also to protect that leadership as well. So we have seen how just those pieces of information can really help unify a regional association that's providing a number of different key services, key functions to congregations. Now we're looking at what we call the iSight dashboard, and this is what helps put it all together. Here we see 6 churches that have run an instrument to get some organizational intelligence, and they've been placed on that iSight dashboard, that energy satisfaction map. And you can see 3 of them are up in this transformational quadrant, 1 of them's down in the static quadrant, 1 of them over in the chaos quadrant, and 1 of them in the recovery quadrant. And so what this gives you is an opportunity to see where an entire regional association is in terms of its it's the health and strength of the churches. Again, with the goal of moving them all northeast as much as possible, so that as you click on any one of these churches, then it pulls up that organizational intelligence. You can do it on a desktop, you can do it on a cell phone or a smartphone, and everyone's working from the same set of information. So basically, to sum up, we've seen how organizational intelligence can provide a uniform set of information that helps a regional association that really wants to be transformational perform these key functions using information that is shared, transparent, and really connectional. When you talk about being a connectional church, this makes it a connectional church in function. I've just added one thing here. This box down in this bottom of the organizational intelligence, and connected to it needs to be evidence-based resources. Many of those can be developed internally. It does require some retraining that's obviously beyond the scope of this presentation for people to begin to think about how do we resource congregations in an evidence-based way, that is, using information that we learn from a particular congregation. How do we put all of the services that we provide coming from different places, different people, different groups and teams? How do we coordinate that in a way that makes sense for helping that church become healthy and vital? But we have also found that most regional associations can't develop all of those resources themselves, and they need to look to some external resources that can help them look at the information, know how to apply it in an evidence-based approach.
Well, I hope you found that presentation on iSight helpful. It may have even spurred some of your own thinking about how you might go about collecting and using organizational intelligence. Now, there's a lot more that could be said. Each of those functions that we looked at could require a day of training in terms of how you use this kind of information in evidence-based work. Also, as we begin to collect this kind of information across an entire region, we can develop regional strategies that are customized to a particular regional association. And also the logistics of how you actually carry out collecting this organizational intelligence could be the topic of an entire presentation itself. But I hope this has been enough to kind of spur your imagination. It's great to live in a time when at the corporate level we can indeed be quick to listen, slow to speak, and just have a lot more fun in the process.